Hey everyone, welcome to Strange Stories, where we explore near-death experiences and supernatural stories from people who've had a glimpse of the other side. If you enjoy our content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel. Without further ado, let's get to the story of the day. Story number 1. Apparently, complications occurred during my son's birth and I was anesthetized. I remember just suddenly sort of floating up in the corner of the room and that there was a very bright light. I told my doctor at the time. I only remember being there, but not being in my body. I was looking out on myself when I noticed the matron literally lifting my ex-husband out of the room, sliding her arms under his armpits and heaving him bodily. She was a large woman. My husband was over 6 foot. He asked what was going on and said he'd just sit in the corner out of the way, but the matron said no, you must leave. Then I noticed a stranger working on me alongside my doctor. I had no idea who he was, where he'd come from, or even when he'd entered the room. It seemed to me at the time, and still does, that I didn't perceive time normally. This stranger wore black, squarish glasses and had a bald spot on the crown of his head. I remember wondering, who is he? What is he up to? What happened to him? Is my child okay? While all of this was going through my mind, I have to admit that I wasn't scared at all, just a little confused. And what's more, I was extremely calm and unconcerned about everything that was going on below me. Then I heard a voice tell me that it's not my time, that I'm needed and that I should go back, that everything would be fine. I remember agreeing because I wanted to be there for my son. I started yelling for the matron when I finally woke up on the ward, about 2 to 3 hours later, saying I wanted to see my son. When she finally entered, she asked how I knew I had a boy. I mentioned seeing him while she was cleaning him up after his birth. She gave me an odd look and walked away. When my doctor came to see me later, I asked him who the stranger who was with him while I was out to it was. He asked how I found out about him. Had the matron told me? I replied that I'd seen him leaning over the top of me while I was laying on the table. I then described him, as stated above, as well as the fact that he was much shorter than him, my doctor being taller, that is. He was surprised that I knew so much about this stranger, who turned out to be a specialist that he, my doctor, had flown in by helicopter while I was knocked out because this happened in a small town and there weren't many doctors available at this hospital. I'd never met this other doctor before or after it all happened. My doctor believed me because, as he put it, how could I have missed the bald spot on the top of this other doctor's head? He did warn me not to tell anyone or they would most likely lock me up. He reiterated that he believed me and found it fascinating, but that he would not discuss it with anyone else. Aside from this letter, I've only told 3 people about the incident. One of them was my younger sister. She had called me late one evening, shortly after giving birth to her first daughter. My son was about 5 years old at the time. She was very upset because she'd had the same experience as I had during childbirth, such as watching from up in the corner of the room, and she didn't understand and hadn't told anyone because she thought she was going insane. I then told her what had happened to me, which seemed to help her a lot. We never talked about it again after that night. The second person is my current husband, who I met not long ago. I also told him how strange it was that most of the time, when someone close to me is ill, I seem to know what is medically wrong, and after going to the doctor and getting a diagnosis, I find that I'd said that was the problem I'd come up with. I seem to know instinctively, and in most cases, I also know what to do, though I always recommend consulting a doctor. The third person was someone I met at work only a few weeks ago. I'm not sure how it came up, but she was describing something weird, as she put it, that had happened to her recently. I found myself simply blurting everything out, and then I felt as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Thank goodness she took it well. We haven't talked about it since. Anyway, when my son was about 8 months old, I went back to have the last of my stitches removed. I'd had quite a few, and my doctor was called out of the examination room while we were talking, and I realized I could read my file, which was open in front of me, and I read I died for 3 minutes while having my son, and that the recommendation was for me not to have any more children. No, I haven't. Story number 2. I was in the Reserve Medical Forces, Territorial Army Medical Corps, and had plenty of hill walking experience all over the UK. I'd been a member of the team that won the UK TAMC hill walking competitions twice in a row, had previously finished second, and was one of the team's strongest members. I'd also walked from Exeter to London 180 miles in 7 days the year before with no backup. My strength was walking. In October 1988, I set out early in the morning from the nearest youth hostel where I'd spent the night to climb Era's highest peak. I was prepared, carrying a full pack for about 6 miles. Mid-morning, I began the ascent along the track by the side of the stream. I got to the saddle by following the path in front of the lock up the stream. It had to be early afternoon by now. Ascended to the peak, returned to the saddle, and the route up appeared to be too steep to attempt with a full pack and no rope. Checked the map and decided to walk along ridges and down at the end where the descent was not so steep. Mid to late afternoon, the wind picked up, mist fell, and exhaustion began to set in. I decided to take a break and use up the last of my water and food supplies. Temperatures and visibility plummeted, and rain began to fall due to the wind chill factor. I needed to get off the ridge as soon as possible and had to rely solely on compass bearings over rocky, steep terrain with a map showing I was near sheer cliff drops. Now, I'm exhausted, cold, wet, without food or water, exposed, and in a geographically dangerous situation. I had no choice but to try to sit it out in the late afternoon. There was a lot of shivering at first, but it quickly subsided because I didn't have the energy to shiver. My extremities were initially frozen, and this gradually spread from fingers, toes, and face to hands, feet, legs, arms, and body, and then nothing. By this point, I was drifting in and out of sleep, seeing myself elsewhere, and then returning to the mountain. I tried the international distress signal, but the wind blew it back to me, and each time it blew, I exposed my face to the element. The mist was so dense that the touchlight, which was used to signal, was also reflected back. There was no way I was going to make it down this mountain alive. I was aware of it and had accepted it. I thought I was going to die now. What did it contain? If I died and there was no afterlife, I would have nothing. But if there was an afterlife, who would I want to see? That individual was my grandmother. She was a devout Christian, and I realized that if she was correct, she'd be in heaven, whereas I was far from being in grace, and thus would not be going to heaven if there was one. So I prayed for forgiveness and to be relieved of my suffering, as well as for those I'd leave behind. I'm not sure what time it was by this point, but I'd made my peace with God and the world. Then it happened. I'm not sure how long it lasted. It seemed like a split second. But before it happened, it was completely dark, and after it happened, dawn was breaking. I found myself, whoever or whatever I was, without a body, completely surrounded by a bright white light unlike anything I'd ever seen before. There was no floor, walls, or ceiling, only light. And the emotions, the closest word I can think of to describing it, filled me with such overwhelming peace, joy, and love, like nothing I'd ever experienced before or since. A man in a white robe, draping down to his feet, stood in front of me. His arms were outstretched, and behind him was a cross made of something other than wood. When he looked at me, I was at peace because both he and I recognized him as Jesus. There were no physical traces of the crucifixion on him, and I've since learned to recognize his state as post-transfiguration. I had died. I found myself back on the mountain as dawn approached, cold, exhausted, thirsty beyond belief, and hungry. However, shortly after dawn, the mist began to lift, and I found myself perched on a small ledge overlooking a 300-foot sheer drop. I could see a sheep track to one side, very close, that could safely lead me off the mountain. I still don't know where I got the strength to come the 4 miles down and back out to civilization, and I still have lost sensation in all of my fingertips, leaving only a constant feeling of pins and needles. I was a pagan when I went up, but I came down a devout Christian, and I still am. My family and friends couldn't believe what had happened and refused to believe me, dismissing it as a post-traumatic stress disorder. So, for the past 15 years, I've kept it to myself, my wife, and my mother-in-law, a devout Christian, because I don't want to risk being labeled with a mental illness or losing confidence from those with whom I live and work. Until recently, I thought I was the only one, or one of a very few,